Welcome, guys, to another close reading of The I and Thou from Martin Buber. Today we'll be looking at, kind of resuming, we'll be going from page 9 to 11, I think mainly because I got stuck. Even though I think the last video was 8 through 10, I mainly got stuck on about halfway through page 9. So we never made it to page 10, actually. But if we want to recall some of the last video was concerning, how do we meet a person as thou? And that was the addressment. So Buber is slowly going from the three different type of spheres that we can experience, or, well, not experience, but we can meet the thou. And so with this meeting, finally we've gone from nature to, from the sphere of nature to the sphere of personal being, which is man to man. And then now we're going into the sphere of spirit. All right, so let's see what Buber has to say of the sphere of spirit. So he says here, "This is the eternal source of art. A man is faced by a form which desires to be made through him into a work. This form is no offspring of his soul, but is an appearance which steps up to it and demands of it the effect of power. The man is concerned with an act of his being. If he carries it through, if he speaks the primary word out of his being to the form which appears, then the effect of power streams out and the work arises. The act includes a sacrifice and a risk. This is the sacrifice, the endless possibility that is offered up on the altar of the form. For everything which just this moment in play ran through, the perspective must be obliterated. Nothing of that may penetrate the work. The exclusiveness of what is facing it demands that it be so. This is the risk. The primary word can only be spoken with the whole being. He who gives himself to it may withhold nothing of himself. The work does not suffer me, as do the tree and the man, to turn aside and relax in the world of it, but it commands. If I do not serve it aright, it is broken, or it breaks me." I'm going to stop right there. So, I've been reading a lot of Nietzsche, especially Zarathustra. I've been kind of rereading certain parts of Thus Spoke Zarathustra again after my initial reading. And there's this very interesting excerpt on self-overcoming that Nietzsche kind of goes into about the will to power. And the reason why I'm bringing up the will to power in contrast to the realm of spirit for Buber, what's kind of fascinating, and it almost seems like if we contrast Nietzsche with Buber would say it's not will to power as to the reason why you want to create. There's actually something before power, and that power, and that before power is actually the word itself, the primary word. So I think this is probably the most Christian and Abrahamic answer, right? The Word came down and became flesh. So I do find it of interest when, Buber does this moment where it's if he speaks the primary word out of his being to the form which appears, then the effective power streams out and the work arises. So Buber is like almost saying, when we take this line specifically, like we don't just have this will to power, right? There is a will to power, but the will to power rests within the primary word. There's something that makes the effective power stream out, and then the work arises. Like I guess you could almost say, like Buber saying, like to Nietzsche, that actually this, this will to create, right? This will to create values and commandments and all this sort. It's not just a will to power to create these things. The will to power itself, and I think this is the Buber answer. The Buber answer is the will to power itself is rooted in the word, the primary word. So I do think that there is that sort of kind of a good note to keep in mind how Buber is sort of looking at the sphere of the sphere of spirit. But let's and also notice, actually, before we continue on, let's notice how, in Nietzsche's Zarathustra, there's this idea that, all creatures obey, but it's that, we don't have any. We're also very bad at following our own commandments, so at our own commanding. So Nietzsche's trying to provoke this idea of like, okay, only those who create good and evil actually know what good and evil is, right? So you have to create in order to know. But there seems to be like the opposite of, like you're not actually in charge, so to speak, in Buber's position. Where actually it's the work itself that commands. Right? We can see here, the work does not suffer me, as do the tree and the man, to turn aside and relax in the world of it. But it commands. If I do not serve it aright, it is broken, or it breaks me. So there's a way in which we're still responding to a command in the very act of creating. Now, there could be probably arguments of whether this is actually opposed to Nietzsche's argument or not. I think there's definitely room to say that actually it's still in line with Nietzsche's argument of creating. But it does kind of add an interesting perspective in the idea of creating art, that actually it's the work itself that commands me, right? It's the form. That sort of confronts me. But yeah, let's continue. So Buber continues to say, I can neither experience nor describe the form which meets me, but only body it forth. And yet I behold it, splendid in the radiance of what confronts me. clearer than all the clearness of the world which is experienced. I do not behold it as a thing among the inner things, nor as an image of my quote, fancy, but as that which exists in the present. If test is made of its objectivity, the form is certainly not, quote, there, unquote. Yet what is actually so much present as it is, and the relation in which I stand to it is real, for it affects me as I affect it. To produce is to draw forth, to invent is to find, to shape is to discover. In embodying forth, I disclose, I lead the form across into the world of it. The work produced is a thing among things, able to be experienced and described as a sum of qualities. But from time to time it can face the receptive beholder in its whole embodied form. I'm just going to repeat that last sentence. But from time to time it can face the receptive beholder in its whole embodied form. So you see how there's this interaction between creating and sort of it's weird. It's almost like Buber is doing this dichotomy of, because he says right here, he says to produce is to draw forth, right? You're not just creating something, you're bringing something forth. And this is where he says to invent is to find, to shape is to discover. There is something that is almost this idea of creating is almost I don't even know the term for it. I guess it would be discovering it. It's almost creating is uncovering, which is kind of counter to the way that we usually think about creating, right? We usually think of creating as sort of bringing something new to the forefront of whatever has been already there. But Buber seems to be almost alluding to this idea of actually creating is this way of uncovering something, right? Bringing forth something. And then of course he's saying here, I lead the form across into the world of it. And so now this work is, a thing among other things, and it can be experienced. But he's saying that at the end, right, and this is the part that I kept repeating, is that, but from time to time, the receptive beholder, it can face the receptive beholder in its whole embodied form. So there is this meeting of the form, right? It's a meeting, and you get this relation, right? And the relation in which I stand to it is real, for it affects me as I affect it. This sort of looking at art, right? And Buber begins this by saying the eternal source of art, I think, and this is the realm of spirit, there's a way in which we have to look at creating as a kind of relation. And there's like a mutual relation, right? Like the work itself commands me, right? There is this mutuality going on with the piece of artwork. When I envision the form in my mind, what it's going to look like, there is this way in which it is commanding me to bring it forth. So there is a real sense of how this work is affecting me and I'm affecting it. And Buber is really sort of nailing on the head this real relation that is going on. And I think if we compare Nietzsche with Buber is really adding a sort of nuance to the way we look at creating, right? Because Nietzsche sort of looks at, every value that we have is basically proof of this will to power, and that we all wish to be masters in the end, right? This is why things always have to sublimate themselves, is because we do have this craving for the will to power. However, it's not, and Nietzsche is very adamant about, becoming a master of yourself. But what Buber is saying is that actually, even in the very act of creating something, you are actually being commanded, right? So it's a very he's almost turning Nietzsche on his head, where he's basically saying, like, if you think being master is creating, actually it's the very act of creating that is you obeying, almost. But it's a deeply mutual relation, meaning that you are commanding and it is also commanding you. So it's I affect you, you affect me. There is not this kind of one-sided relationship. And I think that is kind of like, maybe this can kind of expose a sort of weakness in Nietzsche's thinking, where he's very adamant about becoming a master of yourself, but the problem is that in reality, we're always having a mutual relation, even with the work itself, right? We're not master of the work. The work is also commanding me. So there's this way in which you have to see, and this is kind of like a very Hegelian move, right? You have to see the servant in the master, and you have to see the master in the servant, and how this is always being affected back and forth. We can't just have this like one-sided relation of, well, I'm just going to become master of myself. But again, the argument can be made that Nietzsche does see the opposite within the other, where Nietzsche understands that actually man himself is an obeying creature, so he must come up with his own commandments and obey them. And that's like, so there's like this embodiment of like master and slave, right? Like actually coming up with your own commandments and then obeying them. This is a very interesting relation here. But I think just to kind of go into I think there's just like one more part I wanted to kind of go into, was how Buber talked about how this creating, this act, is a sacrifice and a risk. And if you really do think about it, right, in the moment of you trying to create something, you actually give up, and this is actually very important to note here, you actually give up the moment you start to take form of something. in the art of your creation. You actually give up all the possibilities of what it could be. Right. So in that sense, you sacrifice the endless possibility, and that is what is kind of very fascinating about this idea of creating, is you give up that possibility. And the risk is that, as he says here, the risk is the primary word can only be spoken with the whole being. He who gives himself to it may withhold nothing of himself. Right? So this withhold nothing of yourself is that the work itself commands. And Buber is saying, if you don't serve it right, so there's this nuance to creating, right? If you don't do it right, if you don't serve it right, it will break you, it will be broken, or it will break you. So I do really think Buber is adding some real nuance to what it really means to create. Like, it's not just creating to become master of ourselves, that there is a real sacrifice, a real risk. And in some sense, I feel like Buber is even pushing Nietzsche further into showing you how there is real risk in creating, there is real sacrifice in creating, which is very Nietzschean in general. But I do think Buber is adding more nuance to it. Especially, I feel like there is a kind of response to the will power here in Buber. We're saying, actually the effect of power can only come out through the primary word. So it's the word for Buber. It's the word first, then power. But yeah, anyways, hope you guys enjoyed that. All right, take care.